Buongiorno e benvenuti a tutte le giubbe rosse. Oggi vi portiamo di nuovo una grande puntata con un ospite di calibro internazionale. Si tratta di Benjamin Abelow, che è un autore e un ricercatore statunitense. Lui si definisce un semplice cittadino americano, preoccupato per la situazione geopolitica attuale. È laureato presso la Yale School of Medicine in medicina ed è laureato anche in storia moderna europea presso l'Università della Pennsylvania. Ha lavorato a Washington DC, si è occupato di politica nucleare e lo conoscerete perché è l'autore del bestseller edito da Fazzi in Italia, come l'Occidente ha provocato la guerra in Ucraina. Ben, thank you so much for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you here. Your book has been a sensation in our country. It has sold very well, and it has actually helped a lot in trying to debunk what is, I think, a very, very short-sighted view that the media has on the current war in Ukraine. I would like to go over with you some aspects of your book, and let's just start from the beginning. I mean, let's just start from the origins of this war. You mention in your book that the West bears a great responsibility in this conflict. And just to play devil's advocate here, I would like to know what do you gather? What do you think the West, NATO, the U.S., all the Western powers could have done to actually what could they have done to avert war in Ukraine?
Yeah. Anytime one looks at an historical event, there's no natural stopping point for how far back one should be looking. But a starting point that I think is a convenient starting point and is a reasonable one to begin with is what happened with the collapse or the end of the Soviet Union and the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union then. And what happened was that instead of seeing this as an opportunity for peaceful relations with Russia, the U.S. tried to take advantage and was actually, this was in conjunction with Europe, of course, and NATO, but I think the U.S. was largely responsible for basically being deceptive in their relationship with the Soviet Union and with Russia. In fact, this occurred even before the Soviet Union collapsed. Specifically when Germany was reunifying under NATO auspices, 1990, 1991, there were a number of assurances made, not just by the US, but by Western European powers, that they would not take advantage of the situation by expanding NATO to or toward Russia's borders. And we know now from extensive documentation, a lot of which one can find online at the National Security Archives of George Washington University, as well as in the writings of a scholar named Joshua Shifrinson, that the US was deliberately being deceptive in their relationship with Russia, with the Soviet Union at that time. And I think this certainly was not the immediate cause of the war in any sense, but it initiated a cycle of events and a cycle of mistrust. Then we had the Western powers through NATO expanding to Russia's border. The decision was made apparently as early as 1994, but with the first actual expansion occurring in 1999, another tranche of expansions occurring in 2004, and then the attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO, which was always a red line for Russia, in 2008. There's a lot that happened since then. I can continue from 2008 closer to the present, but let me pause for a moment here and see how you want to focus that.
The treaty that you mentioned earlier about Germany, I think it was the 4+2, was it called? 4+2 treaty. It was mentioned in that treaty that the US and NATO would not actually deploy NATO personnel in the former territory of East Germany. And many NATO supporters, or NATO powers, actually hold that as an absolute truth, meaning that they have actually, that it was the only treaty that they actually signed with the Soviet Union, and they maintain the position that they have actually not breached that agreement, meaning that NATO troops have not been deployed to East Germany, or the former East Germany, but it was actually just the German, the Bundeswehr. This is actually one of the main concerns for Russia, because the former Soviet Union, by signing this treaty, they actually thought, one has to think about the European borders and the European map at that time, and East Germany was the actual border between Western Europe and the Soviet Union. They thought that not expanding beyond that border would mean that they would not expand into Poland or into the Baltics or into Ukraine and Georgia, which are, as you mentioned, the ultimate red lines. But has Russia been deceived in this way, in this sense?
Yeah. First of all, it is, as you suggest, it's often been pointed out that there were no hard and fast treaty commitments with respect to the non-expansion of NATO, but there were multiple public statements. People will often cite James Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, not 1 inch to the east. But there were actually multiple statements by Baker, and not just by Baker, but by many other Western leaders. I had mentioned the name Joshua Shifrinson, a political scientist researcher here in the US, who actually did a very interesting study. And I give some quotations from this in my book, where he actually looked at public statements that were being made and compared them with archival research of what was being said behind closed doors in the US government. And it's very clear that there was a knowing deception involved. But again, I think I would want to emphasize that this is not the only source of the conflict, of course. Mm-hmm. There was the ongoing expansion of NATO, but then there was much more. There was the attempt to bring Ukraine in, and it was recognized by Western leaders that this really was an absolute red line. In 2008, William Burns, who was then the U.S. Secretary of, the U.S. Ambassador to Russia, felt so strongly about it that he sent a confidential cable, followed up by a confidential email to the U.S. Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, saying that he actually titled the cable, "Niet means niet, no means no, Russia's NATO expansion red lines." And another point that's not often made, is that it wasn't just William Burns. There's a security body in the United States, an important element of the U.S. national security state, or one of the 18 or 19 U.S. security intelligence agencies, called the National Intelligence Council. And that council in late 2007 or 2008, we really don't know which it was, but it's now become clear that as early as that, and in conjunction roughly with the statements by Burns, the National Intelligence Council suggested that if the US tried to expand into Ukraine and Georgia, but especially Ukraine, that there was a real chance that Russia would feel so affronted by this move and so endangered that they would not only annex Crimea, but they would actually launch an assault on Ukraine proper. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The annexation of Crimea took place 7 or 8 years after. And then in 2022, something like 14 or 15 years after this prediction, Russia did invade Ukraine. So, it's quite remarkable that sometimes people will assert, "Oh, there's no evidence that NATO expansion had anything to do with this," when in fact we have not just the U.S. ambassador to Russia, but a very prominent and important U.S. national intelligence agency, the National Intelligence Council, stating well over a decade before the war that such a war was actually quite possible if the U.S. tried to bring Ukraine in.
Right. This was Russia. Russia's red lines were always Ukraine and Georgia, and these two countries were um, actually very, very involved in the U.S.'s. I'm not trying to. I know you don't want to talk about intelligence. The U.S. What I'm trying to say is the U.S. tried to expand after the fall of the Soviet Union. Tried to expand its liberal policy through many ways,
Yes.
diplomacy, the financing of some NGOs like USAID, like the National Endowment for Democracy, like other NGOs, and well, through intelligence as well, and they
Yeah.
have been involved in, for example, the 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia, or the 2004 Euromaidan in Ukraine, and they have always tried to destabilize the former Soviet Union countries and Russia itself. Actually, for a whole decade, when Yeltsin was president. Um, what was the U.S. goal? I mean, what were they trying to achieve? Do you gather?
Uh, yeah, well, first of all, you're making very good points. As far as the CIA, just to comment briefly on that, we do know through public sources that at least starting in 2014, the CIA has been very active in Ukraine. It was actually reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post that starting in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, the CIA opened up 12 bases right on Russia's border within Ukraine, and there were probably at least another two deeper within Ukraine. Now, this is what was publicly disclosed. Now, that does not by any means, of course, the claim and the sources for this disclosure was both Ukrainian and US CIA intelligence. But what was the interest in the CIA in revealing that they had these sources starting in 2014? I think it's quite possible, I have no direct evidence of this, that this was a way of, in fact, diverting attention from the possibility that these CIA bases were present in Ukraine well before 2014. Sometimes what the CIA itself would call a limited hangout, where you disclose a certain amount of information that is deliberately disclosed, and it could be accurate information, but it's deliberately disclosed to divert attention from other and more incriminating information.
Right.
So this is quite possible. We do know that people will often look at the annexation of Crimea, or some people will describe it as the reacquisition of Crimea,
Mhm.
or the
Another.
invasion of Crimea. People frame it in many different ways with different levels of accusation attached to it. But we do know from another former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who in fact is a extreme hawk, by no means a pacifist or a dove with respect to Russia. He has publicly stated that the annexation of Crimea was taken in response to was an impulsive move by Putin, taken in response to the Maidan, to the coup that occurred in the Maidan. Now, the Maidan itself, certainly there were important elements within the Ukrainian population that very much were protesting corruption within Ukraine. They wanted Yanukovych, the current president, out. But there were also extreme forces on the far right in Ukraine that were, trying to topple Yanukovych for reasons that had nothing to do with democracy. And the U.S., we don't know the exact role of the U.S. at that time, but it's very clear that the U.S. did ultimately endorse the new regime that had taken over in 2014, even though it was clear that that was an unconstitutional takeover. So there's a great deal to be said about the U.S. involvement. And I think we can only imagine how the U.S. might react if Russia attempted such a thing on and collaborated with a takeover of a government such as that on the U.S. border, for instance, in Canada or Mexico.
Right.
The U.S. certainly would not have tolerated it. Yet when it comes to Russia, we often disregard the fact that we are meddling right on the border of a country that itself not only feels threatened for current reasons, but has a long history of being threatened by the West.
And is also heavily armed and could actually start a nuclear war at any time.
Exactly.
Okay, well, now we have established the causes of this war. How do you see this going forward? I mean, Trump has taken over the government in the U.S. He has vowed to and pledged to end the war. He has talked profusely about this during his election campaign. He has tried to at least talk to Putin, which was something that Biden, for example, hadn't done before. But he has, in the past couple of weeks, been described himself as I'm going to use a colored expression, pissed at Putin for his actions. He has vowed to actually arm Ukraine, which hadn't happened during his presidency yet. And I think what the recent request by the U.S. to raise military budgets for other NATO members is actually all about. I mean, Trump has said that NATO members should up their defense spending up to 5% of GDP to actually finance the war in Ukraine. He has, I hope I'm not quoting him wrong, but I think this is what he has said. And also the EU has pledged, I think yesterday or the day before that, to aid Ukraine by spending up to 10 billion euros. And so we have this situation now in which no part involved wants to budge and nobody wants to talk to each other. How do you see it going forward?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And it is hard to know. Before I comment on that directly, let me just go back one bit to, I think, complete something that about the path that led to the war, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Because I just want to move a little bit forward from 2014, closer to the present. After the overthrow of the government in 2014, there were a number of points where the West could have prevented war. And in fact, not simply could have prevented war, but through the actions they took, really led to war and provoked the war, as I understand it. let me just give you a couple of quick examples. First, there was a set of negotiations in 2014 and 2015 called the Minsk Agreements and the Minsk II, of which France under Francois Hollande and Germany under Angela Merkel were the key players. Now, this was, instead of the US encouraging this process, it seems that if anything, they discouraged this agreement, which could have resolved the crisis in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, which began after the annexation of Crimea. Perhaps even more significant, Zelensky was elected in the late spring of 2019, and he was elected president on a peace platform with over 73% of the Ukrainian population supporting him. But what happened then was two things. Number one, during his inaugural address, he stated that he would be willing to lose his position as president if that was what was required to make peace. But literally 1 week after that occurred, a leader of the far right within Ukraine publicly stated that Zelensky would not lose his position, he would lose his life. And that was just one of several threats on Zelensky's life that gradually contributed to Zelensky giving up a peace-oriented position. Now, at the same time, the US government seems to have been pressuring him to give up that position. Between 2019 and 2020 or 2021, I forget the exact time frame, there were, in addition to a number of prominent congresspeople, such as Lindsey Graham and others, there were two important diplomats that were playing a role in Ukraine at that time. There was William Taylor, who was, I believe in 2019, was chargé d'affaires at the US Embassy in Ukraine, essentially the head of the embassy at that time, temporary head of the embassy. And there was a man named Kurt Volker, who served as special envoy to Ukraine. And both of these men are hawks and apparently pressured Zelensky. And this apparently contributed, along with the pressure within Ukraine from the far right, to Zelensky's move from a peace president to a president who gradually adopted the position of the Ukrainian far right. And also in 2019, the US withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is a treaty that limited intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe. And Russia, there were mutual recriminations. The US accused Russia of violating the treaty, and Russia accused the US of violating the treaty. But the key issue is that Russia wanted to try to negotiate and get to the bottom of this disagreement, but the US refused. And in fact, even after Russia offered, look, let's just have a separate agreement to abide by the limits, the US refused that. So there were really multiple factors that contributed to, I think, an ongoing sense of pressure on Russia. And even in 2021, Russia tried to negotiate an end to NATO expansion and stricter controls on US nuclear weapons. And again, the US refused to negotiate. So I really think that in terms of motivations, I would say I don't like to speak in terms of the US wanted this or the US wanted that. I mean, the US is a country, as is Italy, as is other countries in Europe, both within the countries and within Europe, that consists of hundreds of millions of individuals, each of which have their own views or lack of their views. And even within the government, there are multiple positions. So I would say that there is a very powerful coterie or a very powerful elite within the US foreign policy establishment that has been inordinately distrustful of Russia and wanted to continue the conflict. They refused to be able to imagine that there might be a situation following the Cold War that Russia and the US could actually be in better terms. Anyway, I just wanted to bring things up to date there. I'm happy to respond directly now to some of the questions you asked about Trump just now. Did you want to jump in and just refine that in any way before I respond to that?
Just wanted to point out that the U.S. stance on Russia, I think it stems from if we go way back from George Kennan's 1946 telegraph, in which he kind of sort of just that all that helped his containment ideology. I think and that has been the U.S. That was the U.S. Stance on Russia up until the fall of the Soviet Union. But George Kennan himself in 1997, I think, he actually predicted all of this, and he said that if the U.S. Persevered in their at the time current policy towards Russia, that Russia would actually retaliate. I just wanted to add that, and I just wanted to go back to what we were talking about before about the future of this war, and what the new U.S. the Trump government stance on this war is.
Yeah. Well, first, just to comment very briefly on what you said regarding George Kennan, and he was not alone. I mean, he certainly played a key role in the formation of the policy of containment, as you pointed out. He actually basically proposed that most publicly in a famous article he wrote in the journal Foreign Affairs, that he signed X.
Right.
He didn't put his name on it, but this was extremely influential. And in fact, there were even members of a much more hawkish elite within the U.S. government, probably you could say led by Paul Nitze, who framed a document called the NSC, National Security Council Document 68, which, unlike Kennan, who was seeking to contain Russia and the Soviet Union, Nitze was actually seeking to, quote unquote, roll back the Soviet Union. So a much more aggressive stance. But even Nitze in the late 1990s came out against NATO expansion, saying this is nothing but a provocation. We are asking for trouble. Yeah, as far as Trump, you know, I wish I could offer a optimistic view of things. I was one of those people who, no matter what I felt about Trump on a personal level, I felt that he was quite possibly going to be a very beneficial change from the direction under Biden. And I really was hopeful. I would even say optimistic. You know, not that I necessarily believed that his statement, "I will end this in 24 hours and make peace." You know, that seemed like kind of overblown rhetoric. But even accepting that was the case, I was hopeful that within a short period of time, Trump gave some signs of actually understanding the actual causes of the war. He seemed to properly view this not as a response to a kind of aggressive Hitler-like expansion by Russia, but actually an attempt by Russia to maintain a zone, a secure zone, or we could call it a buffer around its border that was free of Western military powers, especially foreign military powers from the US. So I was quite hopeful, but I have to say that what I see in Trump now is a kind of tremendous inconsistency, incoherence. He seems to go back and forth. He doesn't seem to have the psychological stability or the intelligence or the integrity or the philosophic center to actually make clear statements that about the role that the West did play in contributing to this war. And I think only by dealing with the actual underlying causes of the war can a peaceful solution be easily achieved. So I would say, I retain an openness to the possibility that Trump could yet achieve something important there. But overall, I'm much more pessimistic than I was. I'll add to this, since I'm speaking to a largely European audience here, that I view the European leaders as very much continuing the even worse policies of Biden.
I agree.
This is certainly the case with under Macron in France, with Starmer in the UK, with Merz now in Germany, and certainly under Olaf Scholz, and the with him the Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, an extreme hawk, and we see that within those countries. Italy, I think, is with Ms. Meloni. I think there's seems to be more openness to what I perceive to be a more rational position. Certainly within some of the governments that are within some of the parties that are perceived to be on the right, within Germany, within Slovakia, etc. We see what within Hungary. I think we see, whatever one may think of those political parties,
Right.
I think we see a more realistic view of what the actual causes of the war are. And this is one of the sort of the ironies of the situation, that we have in the countries that we that we often associate with the strongest elements of democracy. We actually see what I perceive to be the most irrational position and the most heavy propaganda against what I think is the actual view of things. And then, of course, within the EU leadership itself, with von der Leyen, and then with the number two person in charge of the EU, who's the foreign policy person,
Kaja Kallas.
Yeah, Kaja Kallas, from former prime minister from Estonia, which itself, of course, has a horrible history with the Soviet Union. But it's very clear that her mindset was deeply shaped by the experiences of Estonia with respect to the Soviet Union, not with modern Russia, and in fact with the experiences of her own family under the Soviet Union. But she is a perfect example of somebody who, her views, I think, are aligned with those of the current of much of the foreign policy elite in the United States, that has been unable to distinguish between the possibility of an expansionist, very dangerous Soviet Union and a much more rational Russia under Putin that one could have a working relationship with. I mean, Putin really has no incentive to, quote unquote, take over Ukraine or take over, Europe. I mean, he has no incentive to even take over even at this late point in the war. He has no incentive to take over Western Ukraine, where this is the center of the Ukrainian nationalism. There would definitely be a rise of terrorist forces that would continue to fight him. He has no interest in such a thing. He's, whatever one thinks of this, how well Russia has managed the sanctions. This is also a country with a much smaller economy than the U.S. and much smaller economy than the EU. He doesn't have an interest in expending Russian resources on military. And I think this is a hopeful element that Putin, contrary to what many in the West perceive, and I hope your audience can hear this as not, a kind of pro-Putinism or something, but I think simply rationally looking at the situation, looking at statements that have come out of Putin, I see him as being a fairly rational player who recognizes that it's not in his interest to try to expand beyond, at this point, certainly not beyond Eastern Ukraine, up to the Dnieper River and maybe some elements of southern Ukraine, possibly Odessa. Beyond that, I think it's very unlikely he would see any value to going beyond that. But of course, this is exactly the opposite view from how members of certain members within the U.S. foreign policy elite, within NATO, within the EU at the senior levels, and among certain of the European heads of state.
Right. I think what most people fail to, and your book describes this in a very clear way. What most people and what most media tend to omit is that Russia wants security assurances just as every other country, every other major country wants them, and we have not done a good job at ensuing that thing. Regarding the peace talks, I want to show you a quick clip from a talk that John Mearsheimer did a couple days ago, and he talks about what the underlying issues, what the underlying reasons for this war are, and he describes them as existential. I'll show you the clip real quick, and if you want, you can comment on that.
Please.
Just to add to what Baljas has said, it's very important, I think, to understand that from the Russian point of view, what's happening in Ukraine is an existential threat. The idea of moving NATO into Ukraine is considered a threat to Russia's survival. Many people in the West find that hard to understand. On the other side, from Ukraine's point of view, what Russia is doing inside of Ukraine is seen as an existential threat. Obviously, they're taking sacred territory and annexing it, making it part of Russia. This is obviously an existential threat. So in the West, what you find is a lot of people are looking for bargaining space between the Ukrainians on one side and the Russians on the other side. There's no bargaining space there because you have two countries that think they're dealing with an existential threat. And then to build on the point that you were making, the Europeans, much less so than the Americans, but the Europeans are steadily reaching the point where they're describing Russia as an existential threat. This is how the Europeans are getting their publics to ante up to build powerful militaries. They're saying the Russians are coming. They're going to conquer all of Ukraine. Then they're going to conquer Eastern Europe. Then they're going to conquer Western Europe. Again,
I think to add on that, I think that what is important here is that the existential threat for Russia could have been easily avoided. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think the sense of threat that Russia perceives is real. This does not mean that I'm persuaded that NATO was actually attempting to create an existential threat for Russia. I mean, I think it's very hard to give definitive answers because, again, we have a range of opinions. And there certainly were some people, and we can see some of them still active in the US government, who would like nothing more than to dismember, to balkanize, and break up Russia.
Right.
And they're very open about this. There are others, I think, who are driven by a perception, an unrealistic one, of Russia's expansionism and the threat that they impose on the West, and they want to build up their military on Russia's borders as a protective bulwark. But I think, before I comment specifically on what John Mearsheimer said, Mearsheimer is someone I have a great deal of respect for. He actually is one of the individuals who endorsed my book. But I find myself somewhat less pessimistic than he is, notwithstanding what I said before. I'll comment on that in a second. But the basically what we're dealing with here is a conflict of, I don't know whether there's an exact translation in Italian, but the term that we would use in America, which has a certain set of connotations, would be a narrative. This is basically a conflict of two narratives. One narrative is that Putin is the new Hitler, that he's seeking to expand and take over not only all of Ukraine, but then to move into Western Europe. And this I refer to sometimes as the Hitler expansion thesis. The other argument is that there were a series of provocations by the West that made Russia feel greatly endangered. Important among these were the expansion of NATO to and toward Russia's border, were the militarization of Ukraine by Western powers outside of NATO, were the abrogation of arms control treaties. And this I refer to as the quote unquote NATO expansion thesis. And I think that as long as one embraces the idea that Putin is the new Hitler, then one tends to view negotiations as appeasement and views it on the model of Chamberlain in the late 1930s with respect to Germany. And in fact, I would say that if there was any persuasive evidence that this was actually the case, then I would be on the other side of this issue. But there is no evidence supporting that view. And in fact, all the evidence runs in the opposite direction. And I think it's really been, I would describe it as a propaganda victory of those elements within the Western elite. And I, again, place primary blame on elements of the US foreign policy elite, but I do not exonerate either broader NATO or some of the European and EU leaders for this. But I believe that it's been a very successful propaganda operation to persuade the public that Putin is in fact the new Hitler. Now, that does not always mean that they are intentionally engaging in propaganda. I think that at least some of the people truly believe it.
Yes.
But I think they're completely wrong. Let me just mention one piece. There's quite a bit of evidence of what Putin and Russia's actual objectives were in this war. Let me give one piece of evidence that supports that direction. And that has to do with what happened within 24 hours of the initiation of this war. And let me point out that that was well before Russia seemed to have run into trouble in taking Kiev. Now, I don't actually think that Russia was trying to take Kiev at that point. I think that that was already during the negotiations that were taking place in Istanbul a month later. But this is immediately after the war started, when Russia was showing itself quite able to move quickly to the Ukrainian capital. Within 24 hours, Russia contacted Ukraine and basically offered an arrangement of a cessation of hostilities and a withdrawal of Russian forces in exchange for a declaration of Ukrainian neutrality.
Right.
Again, this is within 24 hours. And one can actually find information about this on the website of the Ukrainian president. It's present in a talk that Zelensky gave on February 25th, 2022. So I think this is very supportive of the idea that what Russia was really attempting to do with this military operation was to exert pressure on Ukraine to try to extract from them a commitment not to allow NATO expansion. And, this we would call, an action of politics by other means. And then this initial contact between Russia and the office of the Ukrainian president ultimately led to peace negotiations, first in Belarus and then in Istanbul. And we know from multiple sources now, we know from foreign affairs, from hawks within the US government, we know from the former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, who was involved in these negotiations. We know from senior members of the Turkish government and others that it was actually through a process of sabotage by the West, especially by the U.S. and by Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of UK, that these negotiations probably would have been successful had it not been from the interventions of these Western powers, who, again, the same people who I think are deeply struck by an irrational fear of Russia, which they carried over, I think, from the Soviet period. These are the same people that were eager to sabotage the possibility of peace because they did not believe any of Russia's claims that what they really are concerned about is the security of their own borders.
Right. I think what Russia needs to realize now is that maybe with the new administration in the U.S., that they also need to change their approach, because now we are seeing, and understandably so, because they have been deceived in, well, numerous times, 1990, 1996 with the robbed elections, in 2003, 2008, 2015 with the Minsk agreements, and as you said, in Istanbul in 2022. It is understandable now that Russia is, well, a little bit cautious in their relationship with the West. But if we, as a whole, as the world, we have to get out of this war and just try to find peace. Maybe also Russia needs to take a different approach. Would you agree?
Well, I'll say something that I think probably will be unpopular, but I'll just say it because I think it's probably accurate. I think Russia really did go into the Trump administration with quite a different approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's been through a gradual process of Trump's extreme inconsistency, and at least at times his movement towards a position that's closer to what the Biden administration was putting forward, that I think has increasingly made Russia suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example of something that I think is not well understood by many people. We often hear that Russia is refusing to negotiate over this quote unquote 30-day ceasefire or 60-day ceasefire. And what's actually been going on, and this has been publicly stated by Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and others, is not that Russia is opposed per se to a ceasefire, but they refuse to get involved in an unconditional ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen during an unconditional ceasefire is simply that the Western powers, especially the United States, would build up the Ukrainian forces again, and then the war would start again with the Ukraine being in a stronger military position. So simply from military terms, Russia has nothing to gain by that kind of ceasefire. What they have asserted is if we can link that ceasefire in some way to some of our underlying concerns about NATO expansion and the militarization of Ukraine, yes, of course, we can treat that ceasefire as the first step to a broader settlement. But this is a view that has not been consistently accepted by the West. And in fact, it's been turned into a propaganda victory by the US and by the Western powers to say, look, Russia does not want peace because they don't want this ceasefire. If they really wanted a ceasefire, they would accept it. But again, the real issue has to do with Russia is, for perfectly understandable reasons, not willing to engage in an unconditional ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
Let me build on that for 1 second, because in the way what I'm asserting here is a strong Russian position. They're not going to give up their strengths easily.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I want to say, and notwithstanding all of my suspicion about Trump and my pessimism about Trump, I am ultimately somewhat more optimistic than a man like John Mearsheimer, um, for two reasons. One, if Trump can rise above what I think he has shown so far and more consistently and in a effective way discuss what the underlying causes of the war are, I think this could still play an important role in trying to reach a settlement that would be helpful. Two, I think that Russia does have an interest, even though they don't want to put themselves back in a situation like they were in before the war started. They do have an interest in trying to reach some kind of reasonable settlement. They don't have an interest in expanding into Western Ukraine and subjecting themselves to an ongoing, what they would perceive to be a terrorist war by the nationalist forces in Western Ukraine. They don't have an interest in continuing to expend their scarce economic resources on military. Of course, they've done that very effectively, much more effectively than the West imagined, but they are still diverting a great deal of resources from the civilian economy. And this is not in their interest. And I think
Right.
Putin recognizes this. So I think that both parties ultimately have an interest in ending this conflict. And I think Europe has an interest too. Europe is being greatly harmed. I mean, we often hear about deindustrialization
Right.
in Germany. We're talking about, as you pointed out, a 5% GNP. I mean, this is huge. 5% of the gross national product of Europe devoted to building up the military. I mean, unless that's truly necessary, this is a kind of insanity. Um, so I think that all the parties really do have an interest in reaching some kind of settlement. Now, within Ukraine, there's also an interest. I mean, we know that there have been hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have fled the country, who are in hiding. I mean, we have young men in hiding who are being basically kidnapped off the street and dragged to the front. There's vast numbers of Ukrainians who have now moved to Europe or to Russia to get away. There are many, many Ukrainians. I suspect it's probably the majority who do not want this war to continue, and in fact, would be willing to settle for some kind of territorial compromise. I mean, there's even talk now of women being conscripted into
Yes.
the war and sent to the front. I mean, this is a very dangerous situation for Ukrainians. And I think it's really a mistake and ultimately a very unethical mistake for the Western powers to be pushing the propagation of this war, which is really just leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. If the West had allowed Ukraine to go ahead with the peace settlements that looked like they were quite possible in Istanbul, well over 2 years ago, there would be hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives who would be saved. And of course, there would be many tens of thousands of Russian lives saved as well. And we can't forget, I mean, people often dismiss that. These are young men who, whatever one thinks of this war, are fighting for what they perceive to be the safety of their country and their family. And I think a humanitarian perspective is to be concerned and aware of not simply the death and the maiming of vast numbers of Ukrainians, but of young Russians as well.
Right. Just to conclude, Ben, I would like your opinion on what would the West have to offer Russia to be more believable, and what would Russia have to offer to the West to make itself seem less dangerous? What would they have to offer for the other party to be more inclined to sit at a table and just talk about a ceasefire?
Yeah. Well, again, as far as what the U.S. could offer to Russia, I am not optimistic that this will happen because Trump has already proven himself to be so unreliable in his statements. But I think what the West could offer potentially would be, number one, I do believe that psychological factors are important. And I believe that a more open acknowledgement of some of Russia's legitimate security concerns, even aside from any concrete concessions by the West, that a psychological element like that can actually be quite important. As far as more concrete things that the West could offer, again, I'm focusing here on the US. I think reestablishing better relations with Russia, removing sanctions, and establishing business relations with Russia. These are things that benefit Russia, notwithstanding Russia's renewed and intensified relationship with China and with the BRICS countries. Russia really does have an interest in having stable business relationships with the US, and I would assert with Europe as well. As far as what Russia could offer, I think, look, right now, Russia is saying that Russia basically has military possession of something like 70% of these 4 oblasts, Lugansk,
Donetsk,
Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, yes.
yes.
And they are asserting that Ukraine must give up any claim to the remaining 30% roughly of those territories. I don't know if Russia is willing to renounce that, but certainly Russia could potentially make a statement saying they don't want to take over, that they are willing not to take over the remaining 4 relatively eastern oblasts, Zaporizhia, Kherson, etc. Well, I'm getting bungling my names here, but there are 4 other oblasts that basically are more western to these 4 now. And they could say they would not do that. There's also the possibility they would simply renounce the takeover of Odessa. So that there could be territorial elements. And then there, of course, could be elements of trying to strike reasonable arrangements that might help enforce the Ukrainian sense of security for those lands that have not been annexed or taken over. So I think these are some of the ways that I see possibility of Russian concessions and Western concessions. And again, I think maybe I'll just emphasize this because I don't think it's always emphasized. I place a lot of weight on psychological factors, much more than I think most people do who are used to looking at things very strongly in terms of geopolitical, realist politics, etc. I really do believe that while this is not the entire story, that some kind of honest acknowledgement of the role that the West played in promoting Russian insecurity and leading to this conflict, even without acknowledging we did the whole thing, but simply acknowledging an important role, acknowledging the legitimacy of Russian concerns that may have led to this war, I do believe that can be an important, you could call it a concession by the West, or you could call it an emolument that would, when expressed truthfully and consistently, could increase Russian sense of security and decrease a Russian sense of humiliation. I think these weird psychological elements, questions of humiliation, are really very important in international politics. Of course, there can be exceptions, but I think we should not dismiss the idea that psychological factors, just as they play a really important role in our own interpersonal relations, they play a very important role in international relations. The leaders of the country are, after all, individuals. They have their own psychological features. The members of the country that are led by those leaders, they identify psychologically with those leaders, and they identify psychologically with their country. And if these people feel a sense of humiliation and a sense that their own concerns are being disregarded, and that they themselves will feel humiliated, and people will do almost anything not to feel humiliated. I think we can all acknowledge that in our own lives. So I think that's maybe a point that I have to offer that is not always clearly asserted in these geopolitical contexts.
Very, very interesting insight. Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for being with us today. It was a pleasure having this talk with you, and I hope we'll see each other again sometime.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Juan, for having me.
Grazie di averci seguito, vi ricordo di seguirci sul nostro canale Telegram e sul nostro canale YouTube. Ci vediamo alla prossima puntata.